nice brisk Friday morning.
I know it's been cold recently.
It's record-breaking cold.
Is it?
Yeah, there's actually been snow in Malibu and Pasadena.
Really?
Snow in Pasadena and Malibu.
What the heck?
I mean, not like real snow, but like snow. Like people wake up and it's not like frost, it's snow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And within 20 minutes it's gone. But yeah.
No,
we
that's
moved
rare.
out here and people were like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's never cold in California. There is no winter. We're like freezing.
Yeah.
What is going on?
Yeah. Well, but the other difference is it's not designed for the cold.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like London in the summer. Like there's a few days of London summer where it's actually hot and everything goes to shit.
Really?
Well, because nobody's got air conditioning, nobody's got insulation to, deal with heat, and people don't there's no irrigation anywhere, because they don't need to irrigate. So everything dies.
So it sounds like you've had some experience in London.
I was there for
Or are you just making things up?
I was there for 9 years.
For 9 years, really?
Yeah.
Doing what? How did you end up there?
I went to graduate school at the Architectural Association and thought I was going to be there for 16 months and then come back. And 9 years later, I moved to London with 2 suitcases and nothing else. I came back with a wife and 2 kids and a shipping container.
Seriously? Yeah. Holy smokes. Okay, so what happened there? So the AA, first of all, that's for a master's degree? I assume like a year and a half-ish or whatever?
Yeah, so post-professional master's.
Right. And you have a bachelor's in architecture?
Yeah, so I did my undergraduate at USC where I currently teach now. Yeah. And so moved to London in, I guess it was September of 2002. And then came back, I guess just short of 9 years. So it was 2000. Actually, no, it was moved back June of 2011.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So what was the AA like? It's one of those schools that I think everyone knows of, but I mean, I've heard of it for sure. I think most academics or even architects have heard of it, but kind of a mystery.
Yeah, it totally is. That was one of the things I felt like coming home or coming back to LA was interesting in the sense of in London, I was just another AA guy, just another Zaha guy. I worked at Zaha's as well. And then coming back to LA, it was kind of like an urban legend. It was like people were like, "Ooh, I've heard of that place."
What is it like?
Yeah.
What are the secrets?
And it's as an American going there, it was a bit shocking to go there and realize I got there and I was like, "What the? Can I curse?"
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, you curse all the time.
I curse all the time. I actually have to hold back on this because. Yeah. In natural conversation, it sounds normal, but when it's in your ears, it's kind of aggressive. So yeah, you can curse away.
So when I got to the AA, the first day, and you go to the orientation, I didn't do a pre-visit, and I didn't do anything. I just applied, and I got in, and I went, and I got there, and I was like, "What the fuck is this? It's a house."
Really?
It's a Victorian townhouse. Well, it's now a series of, because they've expanded the school, so they just keep buying houses and connecting them.
Wow.
And I'm used to a campus, an American university campus with trees and quads.
And, quads. Places for students to gather and protest to other students.
And it was a house. And then the studio we were in was not even at the main house. It was another house somewhere else. But it was an amazing experience. It's probably the combination of AA and London in particular was probably the singular most life-changing experience in my life, both from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint.
And the AA is located in central London?
Yeah, it's Tottenham Court Road, which is it's Bedford Square, which is literally across the street from a building called Centrepoint, which is literally the geographic center of London. Oh. So it's about as central as you can possibly get.
Gotcha.
It was, I remember my very, very, very first day at the AA. I went to the bathroom and I was standing there taking a leak, and I look over to my right and I look up because he's quite tall, and I was like, "Oh shit, that's Rem Koolhaas."
Really?
And I thought to myself, should I say something? And I thought, maybe not right now.
How's it going? Yep, just taking a leak.
Yeah.
He's human after all.
Yeah. And I think that was, for me, one of the things that was really, really amazing about going to a place like that was, I did my undergraduate at USC, which is obviously a very large university and has quite a lot of disciplines, and architecture is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And as an undergraduate, you're just kind of choosing, kind of randomly going, I'm going to study architecture. And maybe you put a lot of thought into it, maybe you haven't. And there's kids that are all ranges of that. But at the AA, which I would say it's similar to SciArc in that sense, where nobody chooses it unless they've chosen architecture first.
Yeah.
Like wholeheartedly chosen architecture first. And so you get there, and I'd never been in an environment like that where I realized that everyone around me ate, slept, shit architecture, design.
Super serious.
It was their world.
Wait, so does the AA have an undergrad program?
Yeah, it's called diploma. It's called diploma. So there is the diploma school, and then there are a number of graduate programs. And the program I was in was called the Design Research Laboratory, which is, at that time, it was led by Patrick Schumacher, Brett Steele, and Tom Verbs. And now Brett is the dean at UCLA, and Patrick is the director or managing director of Zaha, and Tom is now the associate dean at NYIT.
Wow, there's NYIT. Okay,
Yeah.
I think Eric know him. Those are some pretty big name people. So is the AA just packed with a bunch of faculty like that? It's not a very big school.
No, it's not a big school. It's actually, the other day I actually went to, so I've been involved in this Wikipedia editing thing for a little tiny bit recently with USC, where we're trying to diversify Wikipedia in terms of the entries of architects that are there, and beginning to identify that. So I was a part of this thing. We realized that it was a event that I went to for Diversity Week at USC, where they're talking about how the algorithmic biases, and basically how algorithms are biased because they're still authored by people. And so even though the algorithm itself isn't able to have biases, it is loaded with the inherent biases of the people who author them. And Wikipedia is, I think the numbers they gave us was something like 80% of all Wikipedia editors and authors are white men, which results in Wikipedia content being primarily about white men.
Wait, so is that because? But I always imagined that the selection process on Wikipedia, like going through the editors and choosing who gets to say what and whatever, was done by a human being.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
But
So
they're white.
this is.
But what?
You're saying that the people working for Wikipedia are writing all those
So
things?
nobody work. It's not people who work. Wikipedia is completely open source.
Right.
So it's
So anybody
volunteers?
can go on. It's just that the people who go on, I don't know where they get these numbers, but the people that go on typically are white men, and so that the kind of content of Wikipedia is primarily through the lens of white men.
Sure.
And which actually isn't at all what I meant to start off.
Well, whatever.
But the point being, when I just went to look at the AA Wikipedia entry, and I looked at it, and like the list of alumni and faculty and people that have gone to school there is like nearly every famous architect you can ever imagine has either taught there, gone to school there, or studied there. Like one of those three things. Like you go through that list, and it's like mind blowing.
Right.
But it is a small school and not a big school. And like at the point when I went, this was 2002 when I went there, like your student ID was like something they printed off of Microsoft Word and laminated it, and, I would go in for my visa entry to the UK, and you have this letter and you give it to them that says you're a student, and they look at it and they're like, what the fuck is this school?
Yeah.
They're like, we're not giving you a visa. What is the school?
You don't know the school. This is the best architecture school in the world.
Yeah, and they're like, did you just print this?
Do you know Rem Koolhaas? No, I do not.
Yeah.
I do not. Well, you should.
Yeah.
So, so like, how many students are we talking about? Like, in the master's or in all the entire thing? Are the courses big or?
I don't know what the student body is. I know it's gotten much bigger since I was there. I know the program I was in started off at about 75 students, but by the time we ended, it's like 35, 40.
Wow, that's pretty small.
So like it shrinks dramatically through the course of the program.
So you're really talking about like 2 or 3 studios.
Yeah, it's 3 studios in there was 3 studios in mine, but it's all group projects, so it's all team projects, and the projects are not by quarters or semesters. It's for the whole time you're there. One project for the time you're there.
Really?
And so in the end, you're actually producing. You produce a manuscript, a book, and so it's a research. So you're producing a body of research collectively as a group that comes through the process of design. And so the emphasis in the DRL is on design as research.
Right. Right. Wait, so for 16 months, you're with a group of students, your entire studio, you're producing research and design, kind of on the same thing. That sounds like, do you, I mean, I always hated working in groups in school. So do you get to preview the students from that year and be like, I'm going to defer to next year because this guy, I don't like his name. You're just stuck with him.
Yep. Well, so I would say in hindsight, that was actually one of the best learning experiences I had with how to run a practice and how to work in a team setting.
Right.
Because you have to learn how to negotiate interests and agendas and stakes and all of these things and balance them. And also one of the really kind of, let's say, going back to the diversity issue, one of the points that I realized how important diversity is in the structure of a team. Where my team had originally been 4 men. And there are these kind of milestones of these projects as they go through where at each milestone, it's possible to shift the team structure if you're not happy with it. And at one of the junctures, we had a woman join us, and it completely changed the dynamic of the team. And
it was all guys before?
Yeah. And there was a lot less grunting. There was a lot
less spitting, a lot less farting, a lot less.
Like people become far more conscious of like, let's say, keeping their space tidy. And like we communicated more.
Really?
Like with men, you tend to put your headphones on and work on what you're working on, and you're like, we already talked about it. This is what I'm doing, and now I'm going to do it. And then you find out what each other did later, right? But once Alessandra was her name, Belia. So my teammates were Richard Wang, Stephen Wang. That was also a funny thing. They were both brothers, Taiwanese brothers from New Zealand. And part of the introduction of that course, like when we start the program, like the very first day, they're like, okay, so now you're going to break up into teams. And it was 75 people from around the world. It was like the Noah's Ark of architecture. It was like, 2 people from every country you can think of.
That's cool.
And then you're just kind of looking around, like, who am I standing next to? And I happened to be standing next to Richard. And I was like, he was like, do you want to be on a team? I was like, okay, sure. And I was like, shoot, we got to find more. And he's like, well, I have a brother.
Is he here? Were they twins?
No, they weren't, but they were 1 year apart. And they had,
wow.
Yeah. And I think Stephen had skipped a grade. And then the other guy was Armando Elias from Venezuela. And then we were joined by Alessandra Belia from Italy. And that was our team. And it was a really amazing experience. And I mean, like I said, 35, 40 in my graduating class. Yeah. And one of the most amazing things for me is I look back on that graduating class from that program, and I think there's like 25 offices now. Like
wow.
People who have their own practices, and about 20 that are teaching. So like, and it's, Mark Fornez of the Very Many in New York, Mariana Ibanez and Simon Kim of Ibanez Kim in Boston. They both teach at Mariana teaches at MIT, and Simon teaches at Penn. There's Jason Johnson, who's associate dean at University of Calgary and is also got a practice minus architecture. Sujit Nair, who's in Bangalore, got an amazing practice called SDEG. There's Jorge Godoy in Berlin. It's all I can't name them all off the top of my head. But
the one person who wasn't listed is like, come on, list my name.
Like now I'm like going, oh shit.
That's crazy. I mean, do you think it's because of the education that people receive there, or is it the caliber of people that get accepted to the program, or a combination thereof? Because it's a filtering process, right? I mean, like you said, you're not going to go to the AA for a master's unless you're serious about what you do.
Yeah. So I would say I actually don't think it was that hard to get into.
Really?
I really don't, because, well, this is what I would say about both the AA and London. And you guys lived in New York, so you probably have a similar kind of conception about New York. I feel like London attracted the best, the brightest, or the bravest, right? Because the bravest meant you weren't the best or the brightest, but you had the balls to try it.
Yeah.
Right? Like you had the balls to go do it. And so I wouldn't say everybody at the AA fell into the first category, but they at least all fell into the third category, right? Where they had the balls to go there to try this and make something of it.
Right.
And because of that, I would say it's not about the selection process being exclusive as it is the selection process being self-selecting.
Right.
Right. So that people are pre-filtering. Because I'm not even going to apply. I'm not even going to go unless I feel like I have either the ambition to do it or the ability to do it. One of the two, or both.
Yeah, and I think architecture is a funny thing because it might be that third category that maybe even matters the most a lot of times, I feel like. And especially in the long run, over the course of a decade and whatnot, people fade away. I mean, there's so many talented people I knew in undergrad who were killers, but they don't carry that mentality with them moving on, or they don't choose to take risks professionally. And all the talent in the world doesn't matter if you aren't. If you don't do anything. If you don't do anything with it, which is not to hold anything against them, because life happens. People have kids and they have dogs and they're happy and whatever in suburbia. But it seems to be. I like that description. New York felt that way for sure. Right. And it felt like a lot of the population fell into the brave category, even if they weren't one of the two. And they'll figure it out, they'll figure it out over 10 years.
Right. Well, because they're both cities that I would say give you a lot, but take a lot from you. So you have to be able to, you're not going to stay there unless that balance is at that kind of 51-49 mark.
Really close. All I need is that 1% and it's okay.
That's true.
So what was London like then? I mean, we always hear it's the weather shit and the food is shit and it's expensive.
I've never been, so.
We've never been.
Really?
Well, it's like living in Paris and be like
45-minute train ride.
I always went to
the train's a little bit longer, but you don't have to deal with all.
I always choose to go to the sunny, warm side of Europe. So always Spain and Italy, and I never made it to London. I figured, it's always gonna be there. I can go anytime, and then I move across the world. So now I don't know when I'm gonna go.
London is, so I would say, the food has gotten tremendously better, and the food scene is actually incredible now. But part of that, I would say, is the food scene having gotten better.
Right.
Part of that was when I started in London, I was a student, and I was making nothing and earning nothing, and I went in 2002, which was I'd saved up to go to graduate school, pulled out all my money, and I had been advised by some friends that went to London before that there's really no reason to open a British bank account. Just keep my bank account and pull out money while I'm there.
Right.
That backfired on me tremendously because of the second Iraq War. And so the dollar value went down at the same time that the pound was like doing this. The gestures don't mean anything.
We get it.
The dollar. So when I went there, I think it was when I got admitted, the dollar was like $1 was £1.45. By the middle of my schooling, it was $1 was £2.25. And it was like all my money would literally cut in half.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I had to work. And so what I decided to do was I actually got a job as a bartender, because it was something that I could do while I was in school, that I could do odd hours of the night, and I could have a social. Actually, when I first started meeting British people.
Yeah,
because
sure.
The school is entirely international in every possible sense. And, I started bartending and met a lot of people, and it became like that bar I actually started becoming like an AA hangout. Like all the
and the owner is like, what's happened to our clientele? We have all these depressed and tired looking folks coming in. They wear all black.
Yeah. I mean, it still kind of suited the area. It was in Shoreditch, a bar called Hoxton Square Bar and Grill, which now that area is like, from what I've been told, it's like kind of the tech corridor. But at that time, it was a gentrifying working class community that was being populated by Banksy and Rachel White-Reed, and White Cube Gallery was there, Damien Hirst was in the area, and it was like all young creatives, and it was very sort of rough but cool at the same time.
Yeah.
And then, as you guys know, with all gentrification, the artists come first.
Yeah.
The gays come second. The restaurants and bars follow suit.
Yeah.
Then it becomes the cool, let's say, designer people that want to be connected. And then come the yuppies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's over.
It's over. It's over.
Sounds like a disease that just repeats in cities, right? It's exactly that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the sad thing is, and that's always the issue with gentrification, is like, there's an existing community that's there. And I happened to live in that part of London for a very long time. And my house, we lived in London Fields, and happened to be in London Fields during the London riots, which literally were literally in my backyard. Not my actual backyard, but I could see them from my house. And I had lived in that area for a long time, and very clearly we were part of the gentrifying force.
Yeah.
And what you could see is that you would walk down, we lived right down a street from a street called Broadway Market. Broadway Market was a really, really beautiful street with lots of little boutique shops and restaurants and bars and pubs. And I remember walking down that street and thinking, for all the people that are in the council flats around here, in the kind of public housing, there's literally one place they can afford to go to. Because I'm a young working professional, and there's like, I can't afford to buy a cup of coffee at most of these places, right? Like on a regular basis. Like I can go there as a treat.
Yeah.
But for all these people that have been here their whole lives, and some for generations, like all of this is very clearly no longer for them.
Right.
And so that tension was palpable. And it was something that, I was actually, the riots happened right after I'd started my practice. And I was in the office working on a competition, and I was coming home. My wife had just had we had our second child. So my son had just been born. My wife was at home, and she had somebody helping her. A friend had come over because I was on this deadline to help her take care of the two kids. And she calls me at like 2 a.m, and she was like, "Don't come home tonight. Just stay in the office." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, we're at home. I just sent Jane to go get a pizza." And Jane walked out into the park, and she saw an old man walk through the park and get jumped by 3 kids. So just don't walk through that park tonight.
Yeah. Right.
And so I ended up staying in the office for 3 days because the thing kept going on.
Jeez.
And so,
Wow.
Yeah.
So is your wife British? Is she from London?
No, she's Mexican-American. She's from Los Angeles.
But you met in London?
No.
Okay. Like this is...
But going back to the whole international aspect of London, I would say London had a very, very big part as to why we hit it off. So the one and only time I've ever successfully picked somebody up at a bar was my wife. And we met at the Room in Santa Monica. And according to her, I introduced myself as, "Hi, I'm Alvin. I'm moving to London." You know?
It's a bold statement. It worked, I guess.
And so she had responded with, "Oh, that's great. London's such an international city." And I said, it's actually more international than I even thought. The school that I'm going to, they tell me there's like 60 countries represented in the student body. I said, "I don't think most Americans can name 60 countries."
Yeah.
And she said, "Are you fucking stupid?" And I was like, "You got 5 minutes." And she started going, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and I was timing her, and she got to 60, and I said, "Do you have a boyfriend?"
And how smart is he? If I could name 10 countries, is that acceptable for you? That is interesting because, again, I've never been to London, and I would be the first to admit I'm not very worldly. But I think a lot of Americans, their perception of London is pasty white people, pubs, again, bad
That's
food.
my perception.
That's your perception, and you should be more cultured because you're European. But obviously the AA is kind of its own world, I would imagine. But London in general it felt very international, the city.
Well, more than felt, it was international. Like London is the most cosmopolitan place I've ever been. And I've been a lot of places. And London is, like, as an ethnic American, like a hyphenated Asian American, and as well as a member of a mixed race couple. My wife is Mexican American, and this was, in 1990, or no, it was 2002 when we met. And we felt like we were really unique, in particular the dynamic of being the Asian man with the non-Asian woman.
Yeah.
And then we got to London, and I was like, there's lots of us.
Really?
There's the two kind of like big American stereotypes. So it's actually kind of statistically proven. They've done surveys where they've asked people to rate who they think is the least attractive opposite sex by race. And consistently it's African American women and Asian men are the least desirable in that American spectrum.
Right.
And then I got to London, and I was like, I see lots of they're not African American anymore,
right?
But black women with non-black men, and they're not like long-haired Beyonce, light-skinned black women. They're very ethnic-looking black women,
right?
And I see lots of Asian men with non-Asian women, and London was a place where, like, particularly me as the child of immigrants, I grew up being hyper conscious of accent, like never wanting to convey an accent, and being there's a stigma to having an accent in the U.S. and I think the European accent is a very different stigma.
100%. 100%.
I don't like it though, but
but it's a different stigma. It's an elevating stigma, as opposed to a one
Downgrade,
which as
are you fresh off the boat? Do you speak English?
You are less educated because you don't speak the way I speak.
Right.
But in London, there isn't that, because everybody has an accent, including the British people, because most of the people in London aren't from London, even the British people. And so the British people, you go 4 hours one direction, they have a different accent. 2 hours another direction, they have a different accent. 2 hours another direction, they have a different accent. So everybody has an accent. And a lot of that, I would also say that London owes to its colonial history, right? It's stuck its flag in so many places that all those people came back and said, I'll take a job. You colonized my country. Sure. Give me a job.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. Damn it. I wish I had gone to the AA, and I wish I had gone to London earlier in my life.
It's not too late?
Huh?
It's not too late?
To go to the AA? I don't need to do that.
But so you started your practice there?
Yeah, I started my practice in, it was December 2010 in London, and started it there and moved back in, I think, as I said, like June, July of 2011. So I started the practice with a little bit of a risk factor and kind of a gamble, where we were saving up to buy a house in London, and then 2008, was a crippling kind of moment for the world economy, which meant that the prices didn't drop, but the ability to buy did. Right. So you at that point, I think they were asking for 40% down, and wow. That's just not physically possible.
That's a lot.
That's insane.
Yeah. And so we had like a decent amount of savings, and I was being recruited to a couple teaching positions at different places in the world, and had always wanted to start my practice, and had a few inquiries for projects that, I thought might have a chance to go somewhere. And I realized that, I also always wanted to teach, but I also knew that I didn't have an interest in being a pure academic, of being exclusively academic. Mm-hmm. And that I wanted to have a practice, but I felt like having a practice deserved a full-time endeavor in getting it off the ground. Mm-hmm. And so what I convinced my wife was that we have enough money to live for 8 months, which is when one of these teaching jobs that I've been recruited for would start. So let's bet that I'll get one of them, and we can last that 8 months, and I'll quit my job now and spend the rest of the time trying to get this office off the ground. And my wife was supportive enough to let me do it, and I was lucky enough that certain things fell into place, that I was able to spend some time getting advice from other people, and kind of thinking about things as stupid as like how to set up a file naming structure on a server.
Yeah, of course. No, that shit matters, man. You do it wrong in the beginning, and years later, you're like, this is causing headaches.
And from a name to a website to an agenda to a kind of like, what is it I'm selling besides design?
Sure.
And I think that's one of the things that like I talk about a lot with my students now, is the importance of specificity, right? In terms of being articulate and clear about what you are, who you are, what you're trying to say, what you're trying to do, why that distinguishes you from something else, what your intentions are, and why those things matter, and why words matter, because the words you use to describe yourself and the words you use to describe your work are either going to have certain people read it a certain way or other people disregard it. And that's still something I struggle with today, because I think as architects, we are really, really, really trained to speak to each other.
Yeah. Speak to each other, and we're trained to speak through drawing and through graphic media. I mean, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I've legitimately had days where if I spend the whole day doing Rhino or CAD computer work, at the end of the day, I can't speak to someone. If someone comes up to me and asks a question like, how's your day? Because I swear my brain shifts from like normal language to this graphic one, and it takes like half an hour for my brain to get warmed up and go back.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that happen to you?
No.
No? Okay. No. Does it happen to you?
No.
Okay. Well, 2 out of 3.
My problem is usually getting me to shut up.
Well, I have that too.
It has that problem too. So.
Especially on here, it's an issue. I listen back and I'm like, okay, I need to speak less and let Marina talk more.
But I have noticed that.
Yeah, it's brutal. And it's funny because we were talking about that we were guests on the Arconnect podcast. And there's this very particular moment Marina's like, yeah, David, sometimes in the past, he used to go on for 5 minutes that I wouldn't know what to say. And that I immediately proceed to do that for like 5 minutes. I'm like, fuck.
I don't know what to do now, but
Well,
just cut me off.
Actually, that was fun for me on that podcast, because I started listening to you guys when my friend Wendy Falk was on your show.
Oh, you know Wendy?
Yeah, I know Wendy. And
yeah.
That's like, she posted that she was on this podcast, and I was like, oh, what's this podcast? And so I listened to it, and then I was like, she didn't really talk about what I thought she was going to talk about.
She was really great. She's a pretty serious person, like academic or professionally, we can say. Like her resume, if you look at it, it's 10 pages long.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
And so maybe people would think because of that, they should be really serious on the podcast, on the show. But she was lively, and we talked about all kinds of random things. So.
Well, I mean, I think that's what I appreciate about your podcast is that it is random. Yeah. like you don't know what to expect when you start listening. Like you might, like with Wendy, like I had an expectation because I know her and I've, know her through academic circles. So I know of her in a very particular lens.
Yeah.
And I have spent some time with her in personal settings, but like, let's say I expected the podcast to be focused on her architectural design kind of expertise. And I think that was a nice change. But the Arconnect podcast is when I realized, that was the first time I was like, I've never heard Marina speak so much.
Yeah, and David was like, so do you prefer being a host or being a guest? I was like, actually being a guest, I get to talk more,
I'm telling you, just cut me off. Just cut me off.
It's okay. My wife has the same issue with me. Like we'll be at dinner parties and she's like kicking me under the table. Like, come on.
I do that and he's like, what? I'm like, God, you're not supposed to say that.
Why are you kicking me?
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, is something wrong? Anyways.
Yeah. Totally oblivious. But with good intention.
Yeah. Or wait your turn. Let me finish my point.
So
your wife is not a designer?
No, my wife is a research coordinator at USC Medical Center for cancer research.
Oh, wow. Totally different.
So I like to joke that she plays with boobs for a living.
That is a good description. That's an accurate description, right?
It's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. And we make doodles for a living and then talk about them to ourselves.
Yeah.
I think your point, though, about architects trying to or needing to know how to communicate to other people is a really good one. And also, because I think we forget sometimes that all of the non-architects, which is like 98% of the population, they don't understand how to read drawings or read designs. You can show them two designs of, let's say, modern style, and to most architects, they would clearly say, this one's better, that one is terrible. But for the average person, they both look nice. They're not traditional, they're classical or whatever term they're going to use. So it's like, how do you explain, how do you differentiate yourself as a business, but then also how do you explain the differences between these two to someone who just, it's the same thing to them, Yeah.
And it's a fairly polarizing position because you have the firms that are really good at that, but then they get dismissed by the profession, right? Because they're the sellouts, or they're like not speaking to us anymore. They're speaking to the general public, which is seen as a lesser form of thought, right? Like you're speaking to the masses. Well, I mean, it's kind of like, let's say the difference between, say, a Cardi B versus a Lauryn Hill, right? Like
I don't know these people.
What?
Do you know who these people are?
Of course.
Okay.
Where are you from?
Who's Lauryn Hill?
The Fugees.
The Fugees? Okay, sorry, just continue.
We got some homework to do this
Your
weekend.
hip-hop references are not...
No, I'm sorry. I failed with that.
Okay. Two different levels, definitely.
Right, and so like let's say but I would say in general, like, because I use metaphors a lot when I speak, but also when I talk to students especially. But like I always talk about like the difference in, let's say, fashion or music, or say like within music you have mainstream artists where their artistry is really about selling.
Mm-hmm.
And like once I had children, I really started to understand what made pop music, which is its ability for a 5-year-old to repeat it endlessly. There's one hook, and that's pretty much the whole song.
Yeah.
And so once they learn that hook, they've learned the whole song, right? And then they can repeat it, and they don't really care what the song is saying at all. It's just that sequence of words sounds good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have like really, like, let's say music that is appreciated by musicians, which might be denser, which might be lyrically more challenging, which might have more content, but far fewer people can appreciate it. Right?
Yeah.
Like for a 5-year-old, it goes straight over their head.
Mm-hmm.
So then how do you manage this balance in your own work and your practice? Because it's a tough one, right?
I don't. I struggle.
Yeah.
Like I would say it's a constant struggle. And a very large part of that hurdle for me has been my kind of dual engagement in academia and practice, where, you know, at USC, I'm actually being paid to do research. So I'm not only being paid to teach. So I'm an associate professor, so I'm currently tenured, but I was tenure track prior to that as an assistant professor, which meant I had a 6-year contract to earn tenure. And to earn tenure, you're contractually hired 40-40-20. So 40% of your pay is teaching, 20% of your pay is service, and 40% of your pay is creative research, which
Really?
is the production of books, the production of architecture, the production of exhibitions, the production of just things production of thought. Right?
So this was for a tenure track or once you get tenure? No.
That's tenure track.
Tenure track, okay.
But your performance reviews are 95-5. So 5% on your teaching, 5% on your service, 90% on your creative work.
Whoa.
Wow.
So which means your creative work only counts if it's scholarly. Right? So it doesn't mean I could have a practice and make a lot of money and be successful and have 2,000 housing units built every year and say I'm making a difference in the city, unless I can write about it in an intellectual way that is understood as scholarship. And it's being exhibited in places, and it's being published in certain venues, and it's being published in, say, kind of trade magazine is very different than being published in Log. And so it's the way that the work is being spoken about and the way it's being talked about. And so that has been something I've constantly struggled with, in terms of I have always sort of approached my work as a form of research, but that doesn't sell, right? Because
so let me ask you the qualifications for scholarly work in this kind of scenario. Is an additional qualification that it has to be about professional practice, like trying to get stuff built or stuff that is built, or is that something that you take on because that's your interest? Like, can you qualify by just doing scholarly work that has nothing to do with anything that would ever be built?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's many people who do it, and very, very many. And I think there's a lot of value in that type of work. I mean, some of the biggest influences in my career are people who never built anything.
Yeah.
People like Lebbeus Woods or Archigram. But then there's also, let's say, as somebody who, I practiced for, from 98 to 2002, I was at AECOM here in Los Angeles, working in a large corporate environment. And then immediately following the AA, I was at Zaha's, and then I was at Future Systems, and then I was at Amanda Levitt's office. And in all 4 of those scenarios, it's just practice, right? And it's purely practice. And I was trained to practice and to build things and to make things. But also because of the DRL and places like Zaha's, where there's a heavy dose of kind of research involved in the work and kind of experimental work, I was also trained to kind of explore technology and kind of conceptualize technology and think about it in certain ways. And that became the foundation for my research. And the way I approach the research is I talk about it as applied research, and thinking about how, I guess I had a bunch of students in my office last night from the Bartlett. They were visiting from London. There was 3 studios, and then another visit from Syracuse Architecture, and I was kind of talking to them about this stuff. And first time I'd ever said it, but it really clicked all of a sudden. I was like, if I had to summarize my work in one line, it would be that I try to challenge convention by leveraging technology. And so what I mean by that is that, I was once on a panel in London. It was actually the first public lecture I'd ever given. And it was for a conference called Digital Architecture. and this was at the Building Center in London in 2008, I believe. And on the panel with me was a gentleman by the name of Hanif Kara, who's been like a really fantastic mentor for me. But Hanif is a structural engineer. His practice is called Adams Kara Taylor, and they were the structural engineers for Zaha's Fano Science Center and a bunch of Zaha projects, a bunch of OMA projects, and some really, really high-profile projects. And he's an amazing structural engineer, and also teaches at Harvard. And on that panel, somebody asked him, what's the difference between a great architect and a great engineer? And he kind of made a joke out of it, and he said, great engineers come up with great solutions. And he kind of shoved me with his elbow and laughed, and he said, great architects come up with great problems. And it was kind of a joke, but at the same time, I think it's a really, really interesting provocation about our role as architects as provocateurs, right? So when a client comes to you with a brief, or a faculty member or an instructor comes to you with a brief, they're giving you a brief in the general terms, like the most generic terms possible. I need an office building. I have this many people. I have this much land. I have this much money. And then your job as the designer is to interrogate that and say, what's the underlying question or the underlying problem inside this problem, right? Because if I just jump straight to the solution from there, I'm giving a generic answer to a generic problem.
100%. I was explaining the same exact thing, feels like a month ago. I think it was last week to the students I'm teaching right now, the same exact thing. And it's a mental switch that has to, I guess, happen for a student or a designer to understand what you're talking about. But once you get it, it's like you have to do that every time. Otherwise, you're not really designing. You're just, I don't know, going along with what's generic and what's already been done in a way.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I also talk about a lot with my students is what qualifies the difference between architecture and building. And I would often... So the example I usually give is I talk about the fact that, I think statistically 85% of the built environment is not designed by architects, right? So 85% of what you see around you in the world, granted it's a little bit skewed because we're in the first world, right? So like that, those numbers include the developing world. But what you see around you, 85% of it is not designed by architects. So now you talk about the 15%. Of that 15%, I would say even less of that qualifies as architecture. It still falls in the category of building.
Yeah.
But building still, like all the stuff that is not designed by architects and designed by architects that doesn't qualify as architecture, still has to stand, still has to be waterproof, still has to meet code, still has to have a budget, still has to do all of the kind of utilitarian things that are required of a building. But architecture is where it does more. Right. So what does it do beyond, like, let's say, meeting code and being weatherproof and being structurally sound and being on time and being on budget and being well built? And a lot of that for me is focusing on, does it have a position or a place in relationship to conversations about architecture that are bigger than that building, right? So whether or not that is about its questions about typology or questions about kind of isms or questions about movements or it's challenging certain things or supporting certain things, whatever it is, as long as it has a position in those things and it isn't about, let's say, capital A architecture as, iconic form and that's not what qualifies it as architecture. I think it's about your ability to speak about it in relationship to other things. And I would say that's the same for film, same for music, same for, right? So if you can only talk about this film in isolation, then it's really not cinema, right? If you can only talk about the film as, it was a good movie, period. But I can't say how it relates towards other films and how it's taking this from that film and it's understanding that and challenging that, or it's flipped the entire paradigm of what a romantic comedy could be on its head. That's for me what makes, great cinema, but also what makes great architecture.
Yeah, 100%. Very well said. I think that's true. Do you find it hard, though, to be teaching full-time? I assume you teach studio. And if I remember correctly, USC is 3 days a week.
Yep.
And then also run a practice? Because that's a huge commitment to...
And research?
And then there's the research.
Yeah, how do you manage?
The running joke is I live my life in a permanent state of guilt. So
Wait, why?
Because if basically nothing is ever getting enough attention, whether it's my practice, my projects, my research, my teaching, my kids, my wife, or my health.
Health is at the last. It's the last thing to be listed.
Like all of those things have like. Sometimes I feel like the little Dutch boy, you know, the story about the Dutch boy with the dam, and I'm just like plugging holes into the fingers, and like each time I plug, another hole starts leaking. And, you know, and it's just me like guessing which one's gonna be the next one. You know, trying to make sure that I try to plug them close enough together that I can still reach the other ones.
Right. Yeah. So how big is your practice now?
Small. We're really small. It's myself, 2 full-time people, 1 part-time person. And then, but it fluctuates. Like the largest we've ever been was up to 9. And then the smallest we've ever been is just myself. And then, but one of the nice things is, so my office is in downtown, and we share an office space with 2 other practices. So share space with David Freeland and Brennan Buck of Freeland Buck. David teaches at SciArc, and Brennan teaches at Yale. So Brennan also has an office in New York. So the practice is there, but Brennan's in New York.
Gotcha.
And then Aaron Cuevas and Jonna Massett, who Aaron teaches at USC. And so their practice is CMLA, Curious Minds Los Angeles, which means that the capacity of the office space is much bigger than my practice is, which means there's a little bit more kind of activity and kind of it feels like an office.
Yeah, right.
Like it doesn't feel like there's 3 of us standing there looking at each other. You know?
And when clients come in, this is all of us here.
Oh, exactly. When the clients come in, they don't ask, you don't tell them.
Yeah.
Right. I actually had a client who flew in from China once, and we were sitting at the conference table, and he said, out of all these people, which are your senior designers? And I said, those 3 right there. You know, I didn't say who worked for me, who didn't work for me, but I just said, you know, those 3 right there.
Yeah.
And that the collection of stuff inside the office beyond my stuff and is all architectural, right? So it looks like we have more than we do, but also like, you know, whether it's contracts or details or just contacts, you know, there's always somebody to be like, hey, have you done this before? Or what do you think about this?
That's really interesting. And I feel like it's more interesting than like a standard WeWork incubator where you're just there, you have your seat, your desk, and that's all. It's interesting to have companies who are in the same field sitting next to each other. Like you would think that because you might be competitors in a way that you would want to be away from each other. But in fact, you're using the resource and the knowledge of multiple people in the same field as you need to, right? You don't need to really ask them for anything unless...
But you do get weird moments. Like there was one time where me and David were both pitching for the same project, and we didn't know it. And then we found out, and we were like, I wonder if this guy realizes that the addresses are identical on these 2 different companies submitting proposals at the same time.
Oops, that one went in the trash. Oops.
Yeah. And then the other day, David was having a conversation with one of his consultants and I think complaining about them being behind schedule. And then after he got off the phone, Jonna was like, sorry, they're busy right now because I'm asking them to do this. And so like, you know, like whether it's consultants or clients, it is difficult to avoid the overlap, but that overlap also is beneficial at times where they can give you advice about how to work with a particular consultant because they've worked with them before.
Yeah.
Or they can say, you know, stay away from that consultant because I've worked with them before.
I mean, imagine also having a fresh perspective. I mean, I don't know how much design feedback you're giving to each other, but having, even though you're sharing these things, but the fact you are different entities is kind of interesting. Like, because I think it's a struggle with offices even when they're really big and they have different studios, to get that kind of dynamic where they're benefiting from differences within the larger corporate umbrella.
Yeah.
Either because those differences really don't exist despite what the partners sell to the clients, or because they don't communicate even if they're in the same building, you know.
Well, I mean, at the corporate level, I've always found it really interesting because there's a lot of like large corporate offices that work as multiple business units under one roof that technically compete against one another, and that's how those partners or principals actually illustrate their performance.
Really?
Is like in comparison to one another, like who's the more profitable building unit, which I've always found really difficult. But in our case, because there's no profit center that we're competing against one another, and it is also because I think we're all roughly the same age, we're all part in academia, part in practice, there's a lot more, let's say, exchange. But I wouldn't say we exchange on the work of the project. So we very rarely ever talk to each other about our projects, but it might be more exchange through the culture of design. And I think that's one of the things that for me has been invaluable about architecture. Is I've been really, really fortunate in the sense that the two major centers of my life have been Los Angeles and London. And in both places, the design community is amazing. Like, it's incredible. And you have this kind of network of people that come from around the world to be in either of those two places for the purpose of either teaching at certain places or going to school at certain places or working for certain places. And then once they get there, they start moving between all those places and start, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the incestuousness of architecture, right? Like, and people know each other and people are connected to one another. And, the community here in Los Angeles, I think, is one of the most amazing things for me about Los Angeles is this kind of design community. And, I'm involved with the A&D Museum on the exhibitions committee, and I'm, connected to the AIALA, and, then through the teaching, you get to know faculty at all the different other schools. And, I was recently at reviews at University of Minnesota and at University of Kentucky and University of Cincinnati, and those three, well, like the other two were lectures, but all three of those places, like as I was there, I was thinking to myself, when they have reviews, like all their reviewers are coming from other universities within the region.
Yeah.
But they're like 2-hour drives or 3-hour drives or
really
whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like, okay, Lexington to Cincinnati is a little bit closer, but generally speaking, yes. But in a place like London or Los Angeles or New York, you have reviewers arm's length from like, in LA, there's 8 schools. Yeah. Right? And so, let alone the number of practices, right? And so the number of people that you can reach of just saying, okay, I'm going to have a review, and you're tired of hearing me and you're tired of hearing the other people in the school. You want to hear some outside voices that are going to talk about the work in a different way, which I do think is really important.
Yeah.
Which is also why I have a particular, I guess, informal policy in my practice, which I'm currently breaking, which is that likewise, I always say I have to have one woman in the practice all the time.
So the desks are kept clean, right? That's
But I also try to always say that there has to be multiple people from multiple institutions. Like
that's interesting.
I try not to have more than one person who went to the same school. And
that's interesting.
I'm breaking that right now because 2 of the people I have right now were both at USC. But they're both good, so I'm okay with that.
That's interesting, yeah, because there's definitely firms, I mean, most offices maybe where, the partners or head partners are from X institutions. And then, so like my experience in New York, coming from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, on the West Coast, like everyone knows Cal Poly. And you go to the East Coast, I assumed everyone knows Cal Poly. Not the case. Like, where? Cal Poly? What? What city is that? I'm like, San Luis Obispo? Population of 40,000? No one gives a shit about that place. We don't know you. And then you realize, like, every one of those offices is from Cornell. It's like, all right, well.
It's like the standard.
You guys are going to have your Cornell talk. I guess I'll just order more beer.
Well, I mean, because the thing is that the chances are that the sort of pedagogies of what they've been exposed to at each institution is in part institutionalized. Like it starts to become a part of the culture of that place, and having that multiplicity of voices or conversations and approaches is I think quite important, not only from a diversity standpoint, from a kind of, let's say, equity and inclusion, but also from just like the kind of ability to think through a problem and have different approaches to it.
Yeah, you absolutely need that. And I feel like a lot of offices, what they preach to clients is all that stuff. Open studio, look at all these people mixing. But then how it actually operates is quite exclusive. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I'm sure sometimes it's a conscious effort on their part, but I think a lot of times it's unconscious. They maybe are fooling themselves, I'm not sure. But they are operating to very tightly define what they're doing, and therefore they're going to hire this specific kind of person, which, I mean, I don't know. I guess as you progress, and more your identity, but there's something about the creative agenda that requires having diversity.
Right.
Well,
but also I think some of that stems from being a small practice, right? And as opposed to being a big practice, where a big practice, you're typically hiring on very specific needs, right? And you're like, we need somebody who knows how to detail a facade. And we have a facade package that's due. This project is going to be going on for this long. We're undermanned. We need that. So that's what you're looking for. Where in an office like mine, it's more just I need creative people that can come plug in and be multifaceted and work on lots of different things. Because the reality is that I don't have the projects that require of specificity. Yeah.
So was having your own practice something you knew that you were going to try and do from, like, how early on?
I don't know when I knew for sure, but it was always in the back of my head. Like from the, and I think probably for most architects, right? Like when you start architecture, at least the way I did it, I'd never thought about it as something that was about going to work for SOM, because I didn't even know what SOM was.
Sure.
Right? Like I didn't know that existed.
But even if you did, that'd be a pretty amazing student to be like, I'm going to work for SOM. This is going to be my life. All my projects will be about SOM.
No, I mean, I've had students like that.
Oh man,
come in and, well, whether it's SOM or Zaha or Rem or whatever, like they come in and they're like, this is who I'm going to be, right? And that's also something that I think is difficult with, let's say, the current era of Pinterest, and like that students are identifying targets, not as departure points, but as destinations, right? So this is not where I'm starting the project and turning it into something that's mine. I'm going to work till I get there,
right?
And I'm putting this Pinterest board up in front of me because that's the target rather than the departure point.
And that was different for you specifically, or maybe more generally what you saw when you were entering undergrad or grad school or whatever it was? If it felt like a different approach?
I remember being introduced to the quote unquote internet in my undergraduate studies. Like I remember in my third year in school, one of my best friends, Paul Sambar, took me to Levy Library at USC, and he's like, I got to show you something. and I went over to the computer, and he was like, look, move the mouse around, and I moved, this little finger came up, and I was like, what do I do? He said, click it. And I clicked it, and it went to something else. I was like, wait, there's more information.
What year was this?
Just entered a new dimension.
This is like 1995,
wow.
maybe 1996.
Wow, yeah, totally different then.
Yeah, and like, I remember Paul was really upset because he's like, I showed you that, and 2 weeks later you had a website. And because I got really into it, and I was like, so I had made a website for myself.
That's amazing. It's an interesting observation, because one of the things that was pointed out recently to me, to us, it was that, if you go on the websites of different architecture schools, of let's say 100 different architecture schools across the planet Earth, would you be able to categorize all of them into like 4 or 5 categories because their work is similar? And if that's true, is that somehow tied to your Pinterest observation that everyone has access to these different things, and therefore people are searching out as an end goal and trying to produce work that is as beautiful or as whatever as those things?
Sure. I mean, I think earlier I talked about Brett Steele, who's now the dean at UCLA, and when I was at the AA, he would talk about like tribalism in architecture, and how really architecture was not about a kind of homogeneous practice that encompassed all of this, but it was actually a series of tribes, and that these tribes would kind of territorialize certain things, but then you also have kind of mergings of tribes, and tribes that are kind of collectively working together, and then tribes that are at war, and then tribes that are, it's still like that, right? And I think the kind of different movements and the diversity of thought in architecture is probably a good thing. And I think that's something that is, let's say, becoming more and more defined in some places than others. But I would say like certain schools might have one tribe, other schools might have many tribes. But then also what you'll find is like if a school has one tribe, they tend to get really, really good at that tribe, at being that tribe. But when you have a school that has many tribes, like there's not enough critical mass in each tribe for it to be extremely potent.
Yeah.
And the tribalism thing is something that, from Pinterest can become a very superficial thing, but also because of the internet, you can distribute thought much more freely than you could before as well, right? And so on a certain level, if people don't read, which I'm finding more and more that they don't, whether or not, even on Instagram, where like, you post something and then you explain it in the text, and then people comment, and you're like, didn't you fucking read what I like they comment and they're like talking about the image, but I just said it was a rendering.
Yeah. Oh, you post some things that are quite confusing. You're talking about the rendering versus like an actual photo. Yeah, those are quite fascinating images.
Yeah. Well, those are intentionally trying to be fascinating in that sense. But like I do make it explicit of this is a rendering of, like the hashtag I use is renderings of renderings or representations of representations.
The next time you post it, I'm going to be like, what is this? Again, I lost my question.
Do you
Go
ever
ahead.
go back to London?
Last time I was back was 2 years ago for Zaha's funeral.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, it was only 2 years ago?
Well, it was 3 years ago.
When she actually
passed.
Okay.
And then they did like a immediate funeral right afterwards, which was like a private thing. Or like, I mean, both were private, but the big like ceremony thing that was like inviting people from all over the world and blah, blah, blah was 2 years ago.
So what was it like working at Zaha's office?
The joke that I always say to people is that I think it makes me think about like people who like, okay, first I have to say that I highly respect those that are in the military, and this is not at all meant to kind of diminish their efforts and their experience, but I do feel a sort of understanding of what it might have been like for somebody who's at war, where you well, like, let's say you always see like these movies about kind of Vietnam War veterans, and they see each other and they didn't know each other, but like, oh, remember back in Nam? And like you don't know each other, and you didn't experience it together, but you understand each other. And Zaha's is the one place that I've worked where I definitely feel like I'm not a former employee, I'm an alumnus. And because of that, like similar.
You can rotate it.
Okay, sure. Similar to like say, what you were just saying about Cal Poly, right? Like you can probably connect with other Cal Poly graduates and complain about the same things, right? And identify certain things that you guys share in common. And being at Zaha's, like it was a little bit different for me in the sense that when I joined the office, it was about 45 people. When I left, it was about 150. Now it's like 500 plus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's a very different dynamic. But at the same time, because of that, like last night, the people that came to visit me from the Bartlett were, many of them were current employees of Zaha's office, and we'd never overlapped. But they also were former graduates of the DRL, and we also never overlapped. And those two places are, I would say, I think earlier you guys had a podcast where you talked about being in an office like being in a cult, or being in a school like being in a cult. Right. And I would say that that's very much the case of a place like Zaha's, where like same sort of kind of self-selecting process of the people who would choose to work there, because you do make sacrifices to work there, right? I think the pay scales are very different now than they were when I was there, but whether it's pay or a personal life or hygiene or whatever it is.
I mean, I assume it's the type of office where people work really hard and there's a lot of late nights.
Yeah, but there's a lot of dedication, and there's a lot of like commitment, and I wouldn't say it's abusive because people want to do it.
Yeah, correct.
Right? Like it's sort of, it is a little bit sadomasochistic.
I was just going to say that.
like I don't know, when I remember being in an undergrad, and it was like a big thing amongst me and my friends. They're like, how much did you sleep? 2 hours. Oh, pussy, I haven't slept for 3 days.
3 days?
Yeah.
Wait, so what's the longest you've gone without sleeping? Totally tangent, but I'm curious.
Well, I remember my second year in undergrad. No, it was my first year in undergraduate, and that was when I figured out that I could grow a beard.
You're one of the lucky Asians.
Yeah. But it was, I think I had slept 10 hours in 7 days.
Okay, that can't be healthy. That's extreme.
It wasn't. But I remember going back to my dorm and going, oh my God, what is this on my face?
Is that why it started growing? Gotta sleep less, you see?
10 hours for 7 days.
Yeah, but it was not at all healthy nor productive. And it was something that was done entirely out of like kind of childish machismo.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in school.
It was me going, oh, I can outlast you.
Right.
And I can eat Taco Bell for 10 days straight. It's.
Yes, this sounds very similar to my
that's a thing in California in architecture school.
What, Taco Bell or not sleeping?
Well,
the combination of both?
Well, because Taco Bell is, one, extremely inexpensive, and two, open 24 hours.
Yeah.
God, maybe it's time for a new type of business to open for architecture students besides, Taco Bell.
But I think it is different now. Like for sure, this is also just changing demographics and changing societies. Is like now students are far more concerned with wellness and their health, and like if I look at the desks of my students, like they're eating goji berries and
quinoa, quinoa, or whatever.
Yeah.
But do you feel like they work not as hard as, let's say, your generation or our generation used to?
Well, first, I think my generation is a little bit older than your generation.
Yeah.
But I think there are definitely differences, and I would say that a lot of those differences are constructed. They're constructed through the way they were raised versus the way we were raised. And I read a really interesting article about like why millennials are unhappy. And it was saying that so the article basically said, before we can go into why millennials are unhappy, first we have to define what unhappy means. So for the purposes of this article, we'll say that happiness is the delta between expectation and reality.
Okay.
And so then they went on to compare.
So delta difference for anyone who's like, what's delta?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. But the difference between expectation and reality, and saying that there was a generation in the baby boomers where the expectation was, if you worked your ass off and threw everything you had into it, maybe you will survive. Like maybe you will survive. And then they lived through the 80s boom, and you could have, you could be working as a janitor and save money and buy a house. And then we have, kind of skips my generation, because it always skips my generation. So it's like baby boomers and then millennials. Because I'm like on that cusp of like, I'm near millennials enough to feel like I influenced them, but I'm near enough to know I'm not one of them.
Right.
But they talk about millennials as a generation where they were told that they were special and that they could do anything, whatever they wanted to be, they can be, if all they just had to be themselves.
Right.
And then reality hit them in the face, as in, well, I'm being myself and I am special.
Right.
But why isn't it happening? And I think I've spent a long time thinking about this, because I teach and I deal with young people, and I've tried very hard for very long not to be one of those people that says those millennials. But now I'm starting to realize, okay, there are certain traits that are consistent, and I wouldn't say that they don't work as hard, but I would say that the sort of expectations are different, and the way you have to work with them and the way you have to talk to them is different. And I think that oftentimes I can see a struggle amongst faculty for those that were trained in a particular way and view that as the only way to train others. And it doesn't necessarily work for a different generation, right? In terms of like, there's definitely a sort of history in architecture of like being extremely hard and being extremely tough on your students and asking for more and more and more, and always saying it's not good enough, and motivating by that way. Right. But that doesn't motivate everybody.
That's interesting. I was actually speaking with Roland Walrus Ritter, it's a crazy last name, who's teaching at USC. And he had pointed out something, which was that, as architecture teachers, we don't have any training in teaching. We just have training in architecture, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
Well,
and so he had said he had gone through a training course. It made him realize exactly what you said. Like, there's multiple ways to teach and different ways to communicate to different people, which makes sense. But that's not what I had when I was in school. And that's not, let's say, my first instinct is to maybe not go that route, because my first instinct is just to repeat what happened to me, which is more of kind of the not negative, but continual criticism motivation way,
Well, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about the kind of diversity issues in, not just architecture, but let's say education as a whole. And so at USC, we had Diversity Week a few weeks ago, and like I had to go to all these trainings, and they were really, really fascinating things. And there was this gentleman that was speaking, and he was the Dean of Diversity from Cornell, going back to Cornell again. But they had flown him over to be the keynote speaker for this event, and he was talking about how education is a power structure, and education is a power structure that has been defined and developed for a particular demographic to succeed. And so when you insert somebody into that power structure who doesn't know how that power structure operates and has never been, and the system wasn't defined for, it's really hard for them to succeed. And the example that he gave was that essentially they did this study where they had students in a large lecture, like 300-person lecture course, and they have divided the students into different demographics of those that come from educated backgrounds, meaning that their parents were educated and that their parents went to higher education, and those that were not. And those were the first in their career to go to upper division or upper education. And those students, the grade differential was like astronomical. It was like the students that did not have a previous like a background with their families, let alone their own education, just from their families, were at like the 20th percentile, and other ones were all at the 90th percentile, something like that. But then when you take those same students and put them into a seminar, where in a seminar setting, it's like one instructor, 12 students, and it's more conversational.
Right.
The two groups equalize.
Really?
And he was saying that the difference is that you have a setting where you go in and there's 300 people, and all of those people know how to operate in that system. And so they participate in it, they interject, they participate in the lecture, they understand how to deal with things, they can communicate, and the others feel disenfranchised and they're removed from the scenario. But once they get to the small setting, they can communicate and they can ask questions, and you can deal with them on their terms.
Yeah.
Rather than on the global terms.
Right. The structure becomes kind of localized according to the seminar and the makeup of those people.
Right. And so, this is again something that I learned from having children. Like I did a lot of reading before my daughter was born, and one of the things I read was that a child who has parents who are educated, meaning they went to college, like all threshold was just an undergraduate degree, versus a child whose parents have only gone to high school, I think by their first year has heard something like 100 times more words. Wow. Just heard, like just in the air.
Yeah.
Right? Like just the not in terms of the quantity of words spoken, but the number of words, like different words.
Yeah.
Right. And so just by pure osmosis, the vocabulary difference of what has gone into that child's head versus the other child's head has given a really severe, distinct advantage. And I mean, I think also if you think about have you guys ever read Outliers, the Malcolm Gladwell book?
Mm-mm.
Really, really fascinating book. But it's a book about, it's called Stories of Success, but it's not at all how to be successful. It's a kind of social analysis of what made certain groups successful at certain things. And so one of the things he looks at is why 80% of all NHL players are born between the months of January and April. And he digs this all the way back to say about 80% are Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
And that in Canada, people put their kids onto skates as soon as they can stand. But the cutoff date for being enrolled into all of these sports programs is January. And so if you're entering and your child is going in as, and I think the start date is like 5 years old or whatever, 4 years old or whatever. But if you have a 5-year-old and a 5-year, 11-month-old
right.
on the ice at the same time, the difference in physical ability is astronomical.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then the confidence of that 5-year, like the confidence that is developed in one and the lack of confidence that is emphasized in the other, as I'm good at this, I'm not good at this, widens. And then one group gets the attention because they're the really good athletes and they get the better coaching, and then they get put into the better teams, and then they get put under the better system, and it goes from there. Like obviously the physical attributes and all of the natural abilities still have to be there, but that distinction of your age within a system, because that system enables something that the difference between a 5-year-old and a 5-year, 11-month-old actually is a very large gap to overcome at that age.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wild. That's an interesting book.
Yeah, which is why we decided, both my kids are born in November, and we said, they'll be the oldest in their age. Like, we'll wait.
And we'll start reading the dictionary every night. We'd love to keep, what time is it? Oh no, we had a few more minutes. Sorry. I'm kind of like blind, so I'm looking at the clock. A couple more minutes still. I did want to ask you, so why did you guys leave London? I mean, I guess you mentioned the economic reasons, but would you have stayed there?
For a while, we thought we were going to be in London forever, and we had both gotten permanent residency. Both my children are citizens. But as I said, it's a city that gives you a lot, but takes a lot from you. And I think it was fantastic when our children were infants. But as we started thinking about school, and neither of us is from there, and so we didn't have family there, and both of our families are here. But also just in terms of, let's say, the kind of opportunities, the teaching and the practice and everything, like it just made more sense. We still think about it all the time, and I heard on your podcast, you guys still think about it all the time, in terms of New York.
Yeah, we try not to, not look backwards too much, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard not to, right? Like I've for you, it's still a new experience completely. But like I'd say for David, like I came back to LA, and unlike you, I grew up in LA. Like I spent my entire adult life up until going to London in LA, and I knew the city, or still know the city really well. And like I've lived in probably nearly every corner of the city of Los Angeles, whether it's the West Side or downtown or Mid-City or Koreatown or Melrose or West Hollywood. Like I've lived everywhere. And then I went to London for 9 years, and I came back and I was like, I'm a foreigner in my own city, like because I'd been gone for so long, and I came back, and suddenly I was critical of like everything. Like I'm like, people are so fat. People are so unhealthy. Why does everybody want to drive?
Yeah.
And, you know, for the first 3 years when I came back, I rode a bike everywhere, and I was like the one guy riding my bike. You know, and it was fun, and because ironically I started riding a bike when I moved to London, and because it was the fastest, cheapest way to get around, and it was good exercise.
Yeah.
And I got back to LA, and I got a car, and I was kind of driving around, sitting in traffic all day, every day, going, wait, I used to ride my bike in like shit weather, and it's like perfect weather outside right now, and I'm sitting in this car. But you know, you start to adjust, and suddenly now London feels like a dream.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was something that I remember, and it's a very fond memory, and I think something that my wife and I probably romanticize a little bit, right? Like you know, it's like relationships, right? Like you either romanticize or vilify them afterwards.
Right. It's one or the other. It's never a middle of the road.
Depends how it ends. That's the thing.
Like you look back on it and you go, oh, we had such a good time, or you look back on it and go, I fucking hated that place. you know, and I think with London, it was a place that we had such a great time, and we made so many good friends, and we're still connected to them, and we're lucky enough that all happened in the era of social media, where we're still connected.
Yeah.
You know, like as opposed to like say my undergraduate degree and my high school education, which happened pre-social media, and so like those contacts are all things that are far more tenuous than the connections I made while I was in London.
Yeah.
But I think it's a place that keeps coming back to me, like those students coming to visit last night, or me connecting to people. Like, and this goes back to the kind of incestuous nature of what we do, you know, and the fact that I'm an academic and I go to conferences and I'll see people at conferences from all over the world. But because of London, I can probably literally go to almost any country in the world and have somebody to contact and say, even though they may not be there.
Yeah.
Right. I at least know somebody who came from there, and I can say, hey, I'm going to be in New Zealand. Any suggestions?
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. Yeah, we need to go to London. But how's the food there? We have to go back to that question.
What is better?
You know, the food is
Oh, that's right. You said it's better.
I would say the food is actually pretty good. It's actually really good. And I think that was actually one of my big adjustments coming back to LA, was like portion size. Like we got back to LA and we were like, the first week you're like, oh my God, how are we going to eat all this? The second week you finish it. And the third week you're like, let's get an appetizer.
Only 3 weeks or so is what it takes.
Yeah.
But curry is a real big thing in London, right?
Oh, absolutely. There was, when I was there was a I don't know if it's called a game show, like a reality television show, which was a competition to cook the Queen dinner for her birthday, to cook the quintessential British dinner for the Queen. And the guy that won was a British Indian guy who made chicken tikka masala.
Really?
Yeah. Well, because chicken tikka masala is not Indian.
It's not.
Well,
it's a hybrid.
It was created in England by Indian people for the British people, right? To make Indian food more palatable and more accessible to a local palate. But that would be, I guess, one of the things I would say about London is the cosmopolitan nature combined with its colonial history has made it an amazing food destination for like food from all over the world. And it has now influenced the British food as well, where the British food has gotten much, much, much better. And so, like, you know, it is a place that not only attracts the best and the brightest in architecture and design and finance, but in terms of cooks and chefs and, you know, things of that nature as well. And so, like, the food is great. It's super expensive. Although...
How much is, like, decent curry takeout?
Oh, I don't know anymore.
Oh, back when you were there, let's say.
But, I can't even remember. Probably, like... Well, to be honest, I'd be making up the numbers. But I would say that, the big difference I saw with food in London versus here was the price points. So like in LA, it is possible to get inexpensive, healthy food as an option. In London, when I was there, it was like you're either eating crap if you eat cheap, like absolute crap, or you're going to spend like a decent amount of money to have something worth eating. And so it was, and I think that has slowly started to shift from what I can see.
Yeah.
But because I would say, like in LA, there's a lot of fast food that I actually think is quite good. Over there's a lot of fast food that's just horrible. Like,
really?
Absolutely horrible.
Like White Castle horrible, McDonald's horrible.
Worse.
Worse.
Oh,
Yeah.
gosh.
Worse.
Yeah.
Okay, let's
Yeah, like a deep fried hot dog.
Ew.
Yeah.
Why would you even do that?
Yeah.
I guess you do that if the hot dog. That means the hot dog is so bad that they have to deep fry to make it palatable.
Well, what's worse is they pre-deep fry everything and then they stack them in this tray that's sitting there under a lamp, and then
God.
yeah, there's a lot of pre-cooking of a lot of stuff in fast food, and then it sits there, and then when you get there, they heat it up. And like I remember for me coming up in an American background, like you would never ever see somebody acknowledge the fact that they just microwaved your food for you in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Right? Like if they did it, it's in secret. I'm not saying restaurants here don't do it, but they will never let you know that they did it.
Yeah.
In London, they have the microwave right there in front of you.
Really?
And they have all this stuff that's pre-cooked, and then you order it, and they're like, ding, here you go. and you're like, all right.
What am I paying for?
So what's your favorite spot in LA for food? Since we're new, we know nothing about, where are the good spots. Is there one in particular that you like?
Well, my office is in downtown, and there's a lot of really good restaurants right around there. I'm really fond of a place called Little Sister.
Okay.
And it's on 7th between, I believe it's between Broadway and Hope. But it is a Southeast Asian like kind of fusion place. So it's kind of Thai, Cambodian, Vietnamese mix. Really, really great food. Really, like, this is another thing I'm beginning to realize about restaurants right now, or not just restaurants. Like, as I'm approaching my, I'm now 43. Like, I'm realizing that my generation is coming into power, because I start going into a lot of restaurants or watching movies or films, and I'm like, all their kind of nostalgic references are mine. Right? And so it's a place that you go in there, and it's all 90s hip hop. Like the soundtrack is all 90s hip hop, and I'm realizing it's because the owners are probably my age and probably, like grew up with the same things that I did. But also the other thing, this is a little bit of a plug for them that I really enjoyed, is we went there like their opening week, and my daughter has a shellfish and peanut and sesame allergy.
Oh gosh.
All three.
Yeah, which in that type of cuisine makes it nearly impossible to eat anything. Yeah. And we were looking at the menu and we couldn't choose, and so we asked the waitress, said, she has this allergy, and she said, hang on, let me go check in the kitchen. She went in the kitchen, and then the actual chef came out, and he sat down with us, had a conversation with us, talked about all the things she could and couldn't eat. And he said, let me see what I can do. And he goes back and he made her a special fried rice right off the menu just for her. And then when we got the bill, they charged us for a plain white rice.
Wow.
So as a Chinese guy, I was like, yes, you have my business forever.
Okay, that's a great story. On that note, let's wrap it up. So we have a few moments to talk or whatever afterwards.
Sure.
But this was super awesome. We could talk for another 2 hours for sure. If you're game, we'll have you back on.
That totally flew. I didn't realize that was 2 hours.
Well. How was that?
I was really happy with that one.
I feel like we could have talked to him for like many more hours about life and random stories he probably has about.
Well, we can have him on again. He's local. We're around. Thank you, listener, for tuning into this episode. It's super appreciated. We are on iTunes, Spotify, and of course, YouTube. go to our website. It is midnightcharette.com, 1 R and 2 T's. We have all of our previous episodes on there for free. And if you like what we are doing and you think we're heading in a good direction, then please
give us money.
Give us money. I think we have a donate button on the website.
We have a donate button,
it's
mostly as a joke, because no one is ever going to give us $10,000. But if you have $10,000, you don't know what to do with it, just give it to us.
It's just one button. It's either $10,000 or nothing. That's your only choice. But leave us a review and rate the show on the iTunes app, because that actually really matters in terms of the rankings and things like this. And it shows your support to help us continue. And of course, reach out to us at hello@midnightcharette.com for any questions or topics you think we should be talking about. And I think that's it, right?
I think we're good. Yeah.
All right. We'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye-bye.